Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is wrapped in so many layers of turbulent, momentous change. I've lost count. I no longer enumerate them. Tonight, we're dealing with an island that I got to spend time on just once in 2004, Greenland, which is 5 times the size of California, which is a protectorate. These words are all very specific. It is attached to Denmark by history and law, but it's seeking independence. And our president, for the second time in his first term, he talked about this, and now he's pursuing it with more aggression. Donald Trump, is using very blunt, big stick language to say it's going to be ours, one way or the other, as he put it, literally. Just a few days ago, in front of a room full of oil executives, talking about Venezuela. We're going to discuss this with scientists who've spent big chunks of their career on Greenland's ice sheet, or the periphery where the 57,000 people live. They've put out a letter, a statement that came out a couple of days ago in solidarity with Greenland, the people of Greenland, and with whom they've worked, and whose territory they were honored and privileged to work on. And we have several of them coming on the show live tonight. I hope you'll have some questions of your own. I have plenty. Paul Bierman, who's been on this program, this My Sustained Web venture previously, not too long ago, about very consequential research he's involved with that shows that Greenland went down to rock to it was not like it looks now, and it was not that long ago in geological time, and we'll learn about that. And Yarrow Axford, who's affiliated with Northwestern University, has moved to Boston, has roots in Maine, and has done a ton of work in Greenland as well. So we'll start right in. First of all, it's great to have you both here on Sustain What. I'm Andy Revkin, if I left that out. And I've also written a lot about Arctic policy at the New York Times. I went to the Arctic 4 times total. And what's interesting about the Arctic historically is that peace and security have come through collaboration. The Arctic Council and other entities, there's agreements in place that have kept it actually more peaceful than you might imagine. But that pot has been stirred a lot. Putin, I wrote about it when Putin sent 2 submersibles to the floor of the Arctic Ocean right at the North Pole and planted titanium flags in the seabed, and to say it's ours. And they do claim half of the Arctic Ocean, basically. And now Trump, of course, is stirring the pot. China is in the mix as well. But let's get right into a little bit about this statement that has been written. I think, Yarrow, you had a key role with some colleagues in drafting it, and there's about 202 signatories. So why don't we start with you, Yarrow? First, just tell folks a little bit about your Arctic, your research there, and what drove you and your colleagues to make this statement.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having us on and for shining a spotlight on this topic too tonight. I'm a paleoclimatologist, and my research group at Northwestern reconstructs past shifts in Earth's climate. And the goal there is really to understand how the climate system works by observing it. The only way we can observe really big, long climate shifts is by looking at Earth's past. And there's one of those happening now, and we want to know more about that. I, as a graduate student, worked in the 90s, the late 90s, early aughts, worked in Alaska and then Iceland and the Canadian Arctic. And as I was finishing up my PhD, having spent a lot of time in rooms at scientific conferences, hearing about really alarming observations of what was happening with the Greenland ice sheet in the late 90s, early aughts, I started to think that Greenland was going to be the most important place I could devote my career to studying. And so I pivoted at that point to working in Greenland, where there was just so much that we didn't know about climate history, and also where there was so much that we didn't know about this enormous ice sheet that plays such a big role in global sea level. So since 2010, I've been visiting Greenland for research and had the pleasure of coring lakes to collect sediment records from kind of a lot of different places around the margins of Greenland. This statement really came out of a sense of frustration and shame and anger that a lot of my colleagues have been feeling in light of the rhetoric that's coming from the Trump administration directed towards Greenland. You know, we're people who've spent a lot of time there and have personal connections with people in Greenland, and even those who don't, maybe who use remote sensing and look at Greenland with a satellite. But certainly all of us who study Greenland, I think, are aware that we wouldn't be able to do our research without cooperation from people in Greenland. That cooperation takes all kinds of different forms that I'm happy to talk about tonight, but
Yeah.
it's key to so much of what's been discovered there. And we owe Greenland a real debt of gratitude. You know, the world does for what we know about climate change, thanks to Greenlanders' cooperation and participation and leadership in science. So the goal was partly to speak to people in Greenland and say, we disagree with this administration, and to speak the gratitude, to kind of put words to the gratitude that we feel to people in Greenland. And then at the same time, we wanted to pledge that we will do what we can, what little that is. It's not like scientists feel, or really anyone feels a lot of power right now, I think.
Yeah.
But we wanted to do what we could to speak up here in the United States and use what little power we have to, in particular, reach out to our representatives in DC and encourage our colleagues to do that. So we have a little over 200 signatures so far, and we've limited this statement to only US-based scientists or American scientists working abroad who do research about Greenland or in Greenland. And we've heard from colleagues who don't work on Greenland research, but would love to sign and support this. But we have limited this statement to those of us with that personal connection.
Yeah, let's hear from Paul now too. Paul at the University of Vermont, and one thing you both have faced as well is the home front issues at the same time with the assault on science, climate science here. It's just extraordinary and keeps playing out as well. There's some signs that Congress, the Republicans in Congress, look like they're going to preserve some of the budgets that Trump et al. Have been trying to cut. But that's just one component of what's happened, the erasure of websites, so much else. So, Paul, you've been on here before talking about the history of your work, and you've also worked in Cuba, which is also kind of another target of the Trump administration in the Caribbean. Just weigh in a little bit on what brought you to this point, and you know, what do you see as the goal in this letter?
Well, I would say I signed that letter about 15 seconds after the email showed up in my inbox. I watched it pop in, saw who it was from, clicked on it, and read the letter quickly, and then immediately signed it. Yeah, I think science in the U.S. now is really under the gun of the Trump administration. Luckily, as you say, the Congress and the courts have helped blunt that assault on science. Nevertheless, the National Science Foundation has lost hundreds of people and has been reorganized, and the peer review process, I would say, from my read of it so far, has been at least compromised in how it's going to work. So as a scientist myself working in Greenland, I started there first in 2008, and I've taken 4 trips to Greenland and have since transitioned from doing field work to working with material that's been archived that others have collected, particularly ice cores and sediment below the first U.S. ice core. So really my focus now is partially on doing the science, but very much also on public communication. So the science that I've been doing the last 5 years is of a core that was collected at Camp Century by the U.S. military in 1966. And through amazing work of both American and Danish scientists, has been preserved frozen ever since. And we got the opportunity to work on this 11.5 feet of frozen sediment from beneath the Greenland ice sheet that has illuminated the fragility of that ice sheet. And that 400,000 years ago, when temperatures were about what we have pushed them to today, but carbon dioxide was far lower, 140 parts per million lower than it is today. The ice sheet melted, perhaps not all of it, but at least northwestern Greenland melted away, and there's potential that almost the entire ice sheet was gone at that point. We can't rule that out, I guess is the best way to put it. So that led me not only to publish scientific papers, but to do a lot of writing in the public sphere to try to bring this information forward. That was opinion pieces, that was factual pieces, and it was a book that's over my shoulder here. I can't tell if it's right or left side, depending on how things project. But that came actually out of our science work and editors at Norton asking me to try to take the story public in a way that anybody could pick that book up, read it, and understand why Greenland mattered and why the ice was fragile. So that's why I'm part of this. I think it is a defining, I think Yarrow hinted toward this, it's a defining moment for humanity of whether we can save the ice sheets, particularly Greenland, which is quite fragile. Because if Greenland melts, in the end, global sea level will rise 20 to 25 feet. And that doesn't matter whether you're Democrat or Republican, whether you're Cuban, whether you're American, whether you're South African, you are going to feel that sort of long arms of Greenland reach around the globe. And the reach is going to be sea level. And if the mapping is correct and all of Greenland's ice were to melt, about 500 million people will lose the places they live, the places they work, where they call home, their cities. And if we think we have an immigration and migration crisis right now, imagine if 500 million people have to move on this earth. So to me, that is an existential crisis, and it's why protecting Greenland's ice is the most important piece of national security you could imagine and global security you could imagine. It's not critical minerals, it's not military strategy, it's keeping that ice frozen.
Yeah, and Bill McKibben made that point in a Substack post the other day as well, and certainly it makes sense. This idea of at least potentially slowing the erosion, if not stabilizing things, it's critical. I don't know, Yarrow, in your work, do you get the sense that we're well beyond sort of stabilization as a strategy, as distinct from slowing things down? I don't know if that's come through clearly yet. And we haven't even talked about Antarctica.
Yeah, right. I mean, we're committed to losing quite a bit more ice than's already gone. But we also have the tools to slow down future ice loss considerably, or to choose to accelerate what's happening.
Yeah, you're right. Inaction is a choice.
Yeah. I think what we see over and over again in modern observations is accelerating change in the Earth system. What we see in looking at past climates, including Paul's work and my own and that work by many others, is just exquisite, rather terrifying sensitivity of the Arctic system to even small tweaks in Earth's climate. You see it on any time scale you look at in Earth's past. So that's not answering your question about stability very directly, but I'm just saying, like, change is just wired into the system. And I think our choice is really between dramatically slowing the rate of change that we experience in the future and the rate at which coastlines recede, or speeding that up.
Yeah. So let's get at some of the. We'll just quickly run through the key points in the statement first, and then I want to get into sort of the strategic questions. And I was talking with Paul before we went on the air about how the biggest uncertainty is basically what Trump will do on any particular day or hour of the day. So setting aside the climatic uncertainties and geopolitical, there's that. But the key points here are essentially that, you're a bunch of researchers who've spent a lot of time there. You've worked, as you said earlier, with and for Greenlanders, not just to do the abstract work that has value to the National Science Foundation. You vehemently oppose Trump's aggressive stance regarding Greenland, and reiterate what Greenland leaders have clearly stated, that Greenland is not anyone's to buy or take. Just you want to get into a little bit more about the what the hope is here. Someone earlier, I think on Twitter, responded to one of my posts and say, what are these scientists? Why do they think whatever they say is going to matter in this situation? That's one thing one question is, what would you hope for here as a best case? And obviously this isn't just about 200 scientists. You're just one facet of a big prism of responses.
Yeah. Trump doesn't care what climate scientists think. That's pretty clear.
It's pretty clear.
If anything, I mean, we did have one person express to our group of authors that maybe it'd be counterproductive for climate scientists to speak up on this issue, because anything we want might be the opposite of what he would want. But I think the reality is we have very small voices, and we're not speaking to Trump directly on this.
Right.
This is an issue where we're seeing members of Congress, I think, be more bold about contradicting the president. Quite a few have spoken out from both sides of the aisle, and we really just want to encourage that to keep happening, so that there's some pressure coming from Congress. That's one key goal here. I don't know if Paul has other thoughts.
Well, yeah, Paul, I was going to ask you, and again, you've done the work you did using Cold War data, reflects a lot of the history and geopolitical history of this area too. Maybe you want to weigh in.
Yeah, it has a long and varied and sometimes sordid history of American involvement. Going back to Robert Peary and the exploration prior to his trip close to the North Pole, maybe we should say, which involved impregnating Greenlandic women and taking their source of iron, which is fascinating, which was an iron-nickel meteorite. And the early Western explorers, when they made it to Greenland, marveled at the fact that the Inuit there had metal tools. But that metal was basically refined for them in outer space, right? But Perry loaded fragments of this massive meteorite, tons of meteorite, onto a ship and took it back to New York and sold it to the American Museum of Natural History. So we can start there. And then, in World War II, we had a treaty with the Danes that allowed us free rein to build bases. Those bases were critical to bring materials, particularly airplanes, to the Allies under the Lend-Lease Act. And then once we entered the war, so they didn't have to worry about U-boats in the North Atlantic. So we had upwards of 10 bases in Greenland, various parts of Greenland, a few major ones and many minor ones. Beginning of the Cold War, we put a base of 10,000 people in Thule. We had nuclear weapons, we had nuclear-equipped bombers, and we still have the right to do that with the treaty with the Danes, which is why the whole dust up over this just leaves me scratching my head and having trouble sleeping sometimes. I think this is completely unnecessary, and I think one of the Danish politicians would say all the Americans do is have to ask nicely, and you can have whatever you want, basically, in Greenland, in terms of strategic importance. So I think my focus has not been fussing with that, because I don't think as scientists we can make a difference, but where we can make a big difference, and where I think it's important to speak to you and speak to others who are listening, is with the American public, to help educate people about the history of what's gone on in Greenland, the importance of it, beyond politics, and that comes back to the ice and the climate, but also to tell people that we don't need to seize the island to have what we need militarily to feel more secure, that we have treaty rights with Denmark. Denmark is one of our oldest allies. We fought together with the Danes in World War II in Greenland. It simply, I think, to me, is a really important place for us to speak out publicly and to educate our neighbors and our fellow citizens about why it's a better idea to do this in a friendly fashion than it is to do it in imperialist fashion.
That it's certainly, that 1951 document makes it clear we can pretty much, as you say, do whatever would be needed to have the security questions addressed, I want to see if I can show Al Jazeera just in the last 24 hours had a really good post. I think the sound should work here. If you don't hear it, I'll stop right away. Hold on. There's a moment where a Greenlandic woman says something interesting.
As Greenlanders nervous.
Of course, I'm a little bit worried.
Hold on.
We're standing in between and we have nothing to say.
So the voices of Greenlanders you don't think are being heard at the moment?
We're standing in between and we have nothing to say. This gets at the reality that people, I think 85% of Greenlanders in a recent survey, they still do want independence from Denmark. So there's this dynamic that's several dimensions at once, where the people of Greenland, citizens, don't want to be part of either big power structure necessarily. And as I wrote in my piece today, if there were a way for an open referendum to happen in Greenland without interference from the United States, which is not guaranteed, there's already been work on the ground there. Donald Trump Jr. went there in January with Charlie Kirk and others. And there's been Danish reporting indicating that there's already sort of a subsurface effort by the U.S. to sway Greenlanders. And just this week, there was a report from Reuters about Trump offering $100,000 check to every Greenlander to tip the balance. But backing away from that, if there was a way for this small community along the fringes of this ice sheet to determine its own future, and there are also ways for it to partner with the United States going forward if they want that. And I don't know, maybe if it's a little outside your expertise, but certainly, Paul, and Yarrow, you've thought about these kinds of things too. Do you foresee this? What we listen to in the media, what we do in the media is we pay attention to the war drums and the big sticks, and we're less apt to write about or consider the more subtle possible paths going forward.
Although, it's interesting, Andy, that of all the pieces I wrote on Greenland, the one that seemed to attract the most attention was a piece in the conversation that suggested that, in fact, extracting minerals and extracting oil was going to be a really difficult thing to do in Greenland.
Yeah.
And that there were geologic reasons, geologic hazards, landslides, rock slides, tsunamis, icebergs, that made it, in some sense, very much not only logistically difficult, but financially difficult because of the costs of extraction in a place where it's so cold so much of the year, where it's so dark, where there's no national road network, there's no national electrical grid, and there are simply not enough people living there to have the quantity of skilled workers you'd need to do this natural resource extraction.
Right.
That got more attention from the press than, maybe not quite as much as the ice sheet disappeared, but it got an awful lot of traction because I think it was trying to speak rationally to what was a set of fairly irrational ideas.
Yeah.
And people can understand that, there's an oil rig and there's an iceberg, right?
Right.
Or, wow, it's minus 40. How do you possibly do mining operations and have the oil flow in trucks at minus 40?
Well, by the way, that meeting at the White House on Friday was all about how hard it'll be in Venezuela, which is a semi-tropical country with at least some semblance of infrastructure. So it's an interesting thing.
Greenland.
Well,
I'd love to return to your point and the point made by the woman in that video that Greenlandic voices have been so muted in this conversation and not often included. And I've been really frustrated that the media coverage I see pits this as Denmark and the US as the key players, but there are people who live in Greenland and that tends to get lost. And as I understand it, law and treaties dictate that the people in Greenland do have the ability and right to decide what's going to happen. It's whether we choose to honor long-standing international treaties. They're 75 years old and were updated more recently to reflect self-governance of Greenlanders with respect to Denmark. So our statement has two quotes in it, and one is from the Prime Minister of Greenland, and one is from Sarah Olsvig, who's an Inuit woman and a PhD, and she's Greenlandic, and she's chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council. They both make very clear statements that express what Greenlanders want to have happen, which is stop the violent rhetoric, and we get to decide.
Right. Yeah, and she's been very active. I'm going to try to do a subsequent show with Greenland representatives, particularly from the indigenous community there. So, because in so many parts of the world I've dealt with over the decades, the closer you get to the on the ground faces, the more important it is. There's some really interesting questions that have come in from someone on YouTube about China. Trump was yelling about China and Russia ships off of Greenland, and I wrote in the piece that I wrote. I looked at what the Arctic Council has written about this. Not the Arctic Council, Arctic Institute, which is really dug in on all these questions. And I'll show what they said just to answer the question about China. Hold on a second while I pull that up. Hold on, I'll get there. Oh yeah, here we go. Yes, the Arctic Institute, Andreas Oshagan, who writes there, he basically rejects Trump's claims about China, Russia, and China. He's actually warning the administration that they're more interested in the waters off of Alaska. You're on the wrong side of the Arctic Basin, and he has he says, do Russian naval vessels sail around Greenland? No, they sail in the Barents Sea around Svalbard, up on the northern perimeters of Europe, and along the Norwegian coast. There may be some Russian submarines sailing on Greenland, but hardly more there than around the Canadian islands in the north or around Iceland. Do Chinese ships sail around Greenland? No. They mainly sail to and from Russia with raw materials. They sail outside Alaska to hold military exercises. And China and Russia have done joint military exercises in the waters off the Aleutians, the other side of the Arctic. So while this whole focus on Greenland is missing these big strategic realities, so that's from, I'm not sure what Minji, thanks for, I'm not sure where you are in the world, but thank you for weighing in. Well, what if it's not about resources? Like I think about strategy. Yeah, but this is the issue. You have to parse out strategic questions. And we, as Paul was saying earlier, we already have bases in Greenland and we could expand them if we need to. So do we need to invade? That's another question. One thing I want to bring up, by the way, as well, is that the Wall Street Journal, which is has actually broken with Trump on some issues, definitely broke with him on this issue. They have a piece up that just went up, Invade Greenland, why? And they basically reiterate some of the same points Paul and you were making about existing treaties. And they have a video version of it. I might just play it for a second.
We need Greenland for national security and even international security.
President Trump has good strategic instincts about Greenland, the world's largest island. And since his return to the White House, he hasn't lost sight of his objective.
I think we're going to get it. One way or the other, we're going to get it.
What is regrettable is that his interest seems to be devolving into a self-defeating exercise in U.S. bullying.
Right now, Greenland is covered with Russian and Chinese ships all over the place. We need Greenland from the standpoint of national security. And Denmark is not going to be able to do it, I can tell you.
The U.S. does need to hedge against future Russian and Chinese inroads in the Danish territory. Nearby are vital submarine lanes, and the island hosts U.S. missile defense radar that protects the homeland. Then there's the reserves of rare earth minerals beneath the ice. Back in 2019, Liberals booed Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton when he suggested buying the island. But he had a point, yet the operative word was buy, a free agreement among the US, NATO ally Denmark, and Greenland's 56,000 people. Instead, this.
Nobody's going to fight the United States militarily over the future of Greenland.
A day later,
I know that past presidents and past leaders have often ruled things out. That's not something this president does.
from a negotiating point of view, Mr. Trump perhaps believes this is the best way to settle on a deal to buy the island or arrive at some other expanded US presence. But even the suggestion of force is damaging America's interests across the Atlantic.
Yeah, so really important points from the Wall Street Journal of all places, the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, the conservative voice of the opinion side of the journal. Any quick thoughts? Does that make you feel a little bit better?
I'm continue to be baffled with the focus on strategic importance right now. I understood it from my research and my reading during the Cold War years, before we had functional ICBMs, before we had so much electronic and space-based monitoring, that we needed radar bases in Greenland to track incoming bombers or missiles, and that Greenland was the path from Moscow and the Soviet Union to the continental United States. But the technology we have right now, and the fact that the U.S. military, starting in the late 60s, basically pulled almost all of our soldiers and weaponry out of Greenland, and now all of a sudden, when Trump appears, it's important again. I don't think it's based in reality, and the whole critical mineral thing too is really hard, sort of as a geoscientist and a glacial geologist, to swallow. We don't actually know exactly what's under the ice and where. Mm-hmm. And the idea that we are going to be mining in places where the ice is just left is almost laughable. It's full of sediment and water and melting permafrost, and it's a really unstable environment, as Yarrow knows, anywhere near that ice margin. You're not going to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in a mine in a place where things are melting and crashing and failing all the time. And yes, certainly there are mineral deposits in Gaius. The Danish survey has done a good job of mapping a lot of those. But many of them are in extremely remote, difficult to access areas. And so the investment, the same thing that you were saying in the Times this morning, was that article yesterday, or I guess the Friday meeting with oil executives, where none of them thought that politically Venezuela was a stable place they wanted to invest billions or tens of billions of dollars in. Greenland is quite stable politically, but it's not stable geologically right now with all the melt that's going on, and the thawing permafrost and the collapsing hill slopes. Right. And I think it probably speaks for itself that Greenland's been open to mining for a long time, but I think, from what I understand, there's exactly one operating mine in Greenland right now for minerals, and it's an anorthosite mine outside of Kangerlussuaq. And it's shut down for the winter right now because it's so hard to get to. So you think if we're going to accept the capitalist philosophy that business will go where there's money to be made, why isn't Greenland already covered in mines? Because the government, with the exception of uranium, which they have outlawed the mining of, and we can talk about why that might be, and they have decided after more than a decade of exploration not to pursue fossil fuel extraction in Greenland. But there's plenty of opportunities for minerals, and there are plenty of deposits, but companies aren't doing it. So that seems like the economic system speaking pretty loudly.
And we already have, if it were strategic in a military sense or were strategic economically, we have access.
Exactly. So if it were strategic militarily, why did we pull 10,000 soldiers from Thule and replace them with, I think, 100 or 150 active military there right now? It's a factor of 100 difference. But we chose to pull them out. The Danes didn't say, take the soldiers away.
And we had the right, as I understand it, to send soldiers back there. And I've stayed in those barracks. They still have working bathrooms,
Well, many of the barracks actually
apparently
are gone at this point because the permafrost did so much damage to the material. What was built in the 50s did not anticipate climate change and the active layer thawing and the mess that comes from that. But yet we could clearly quickly build places for people. Thule was mostly built in the summer. From what Life magazine called the biggest invasion since D-Day, with landing craft. I mean, the photographs and the film of that are stunning. It looks like an invasion with landing craft and cranes and thousands of men and aircraft and all these things coming.
And it must have really felt like one to the community that was displaced by the building of that base.
Yes, and there's a horrible story of that, and the people who were removed to a town that was not in the right place and with buildings that they couldn't shelter in, and many of them died the first winter, apparently.
Oh, hold on. I'm showing something only marginally related. I was going to show a different video clip. You're talking about the rate of change. This is relevant to that. Certainly, the Arctic generally is transforming into a region where open water will be more common in summers for the foreseeable future. So this reality is something that I started writing about that aspect of Arctic change back in 2001. And just 2 years later, I was on that ice cap at the North Pole, not the ice, the floating sea ice. And now that you can't go there, and you can't do what I did. The annual science effort that went onto the floating sea ice is no longer possible because of the rate of change. And it's important for people to understand that as well. This is just showing that component, the ice kind of sliding past Greenland out into the Atlantic, and the circulation is related to other big changes in the Atlantic that may pose threats as well. Sorry.
There's a really interesting comment that's showing up on our screen anyway.
Yeah. Trump doesn't want to leave Greenland to Europe as he distances the U.S. from Eurasia and focuses on the Western Hemisphere. What do you think?
I don't know. It did get me thinking, if in fact he's distancing himself from Eurasia, it seems to me that he's distancing himself in many ways from Europe and our European allies, and that Greenland is a catalyst for doing that.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard plenty of arguments for the basic strategic value of increased Greenland-U.S. dynamics. I don't think it's the most important thing in the Arctic even, but it feels like there's some logic there. I don't think any of that is relevant to Trump's decision.
I guess if we were being generous, we could just say it's a matter of style.
Yeah. Here's the second part of that comment. By making Greenland a U.S. territory, he gets to have his cake and eat it too, by appeasing Russia and China's philosophy of multipolarity while improving the American resource base and strategic position.
You see, I disagree with the latter part of that statement, because we have the same strategic Greenland doesn't need to be a territory for us to have that strategic position. I guess unless it can declared complete independence from Denmark and then said the treaty that the Danes have signed with the U.S. is no longer valid.
Yeah.
My suspicion is that wouldn't happen, given that in Yarrow, correct me if I'm wrong, I think about a third of the Greenlandic government budget is subsidy from Denmark at this point. Is that still correct?
I don't know those numbers.
It's a big number.
It sounds roughly, yeah.
And so I think one of the arguments that's been made is that the natural resources in Greenland can be developed to a point where it would then help catalyze full independence for the Greenlandic people from Denmark, because they wouldn't have the financial need that they do now. And I know one of the other things that Greenland is doing, which I think is we should talk about, is a move to try to reduce their fossil fuel usage by increasing the amount of hydropower generation.
Mm-hmm.
Nuke has a plan in the next decade to be completely hydropowered by adding dam and reservoir capacity.
They're largely hydropowered already, right?
Largely, but I think many of the outlying smaller towns are not. And I think Nuke is, I'm not even sure it's above 50% right now, but there's a plan that's going on right now in construction, I believe, that's going to expand that. But, of all the things I heard in the Senate hearing about a year ago that Ted Cruz ran, which went on for a very long time. There was about 10 minutes, one person who discussed the potential for Greenland's hydropower generation, in part because of the accelerated melting of the ice sheet, but even just the steady state melting of the ice sheet and the fact that there are large, deep lakes that act as natural reservoirs. So that even during the winter, there's still sufficient hydrologic head to drive turbines, even if the ice is not aggressively melting at that point. And the suggestion, which I first thought was kind of strange, but now I think about it, actually this makes a lot of sense, is why are we building AI data centers or data centers of any kind in places where we have to use fossil fuels to generate power? Yet we're moving data around the planet in fiber optics at basically the speed of light. The suggestion was, why not put these data centers in Greenland and use hydropower to run them rather than fossil fuels? Because you've got this water. It's not particularly difficult or expensive to build the dams and the generation capacity to do it, and it doesn't increase fossil fuel usage. So that actually kind of perked me up when I was thinking about that, going, this might be the one sensical thing that came out of the several-hour hearing. And I've never heard anything more of it since then.
Yeah, well, I just found an article here, "The Secrets of Hydropower in Greenland." There's a lot of water there. Unlike some of the other hydropower regions, like in the Himalayas, for example, where you'd run out pretty quickly. This is a very different setup.
Is that picture actually Greenland?
Let's see. Damos, south of Greenland, yeah.
Okay.
It's a 7 megawatt dam, the south of Greenland, a prime location for large-scale hydropower projects.
Yeah. I'm sure Paul would agree that this is interesting to the extent that it's what people in Greenland would want, right? It's their water, it's their resource.
Exactly.
And I find it it's just among the countless surreal things that are happening in 2025 and 2026 already. It's surreal that we, nationally are having this conversation about sort of what Greenland has to offer us when it's home to the people who live there, and all the things we're talking about are theirs. And I'm just thinking about, in the context of this hydropower question, Iceland did kind of a similar thing. They have hydropower resources and, of course, geothermal resources as well. But maybe a decade or so ago, they did a big hydropower development to provide clean energy for primarily aluminum, generation of aluminum. Mm-hmm. And it means that aluminum has a lower carbon footprint, but it was also very, very locally controversial because it dammed very precious wilderness that was important to a lot of people in Greenland. So hydropower is not obviously without its issues as well, although I do think the issues would be very different in Greenland, where you've got a very big island and a very small population, and Iceland's a very small island. And one sense I certainly have had from conversations with folks in Greenland is that people want economic development, they want investment in Greenland, they want, to some extent, more tourism, and like people everywhere, jobs and opportunities. And so there's that hunger for that. And I kind of had the sense, and it's certainly not this isn't what I study, just a personal anecdotal statement, but I've had the sense that until recently, Greenlanders really looked at the US and Americans as friendly allies who might have the potential to bring different kinds of investment to Greenland. I fear we're losing the sort of rising goodwill that I sensed from people in Greenland as a result of the rhetoric that's happening now. But there's this desire for good faith, trustworthy investment and engagement.
Oh, I think we have lost that globally at this point.
Yeah, well, you can see the same thing in Venezuela, where Trump has already rejected the idea of the government that theoretically was elected with a strong majority by the people is not going to be who he'll be dealing with going forward. Same kind of brute force approach to diplomacy. If you want to, it doesn't even come in the category of diplomacy. It's in some. We're in a strange moment from right down the block to around the world because of this figure who has captured the attention of a big chunk of Americans.
But I think in some ways, in talking to you both tonight, I think it's actually more coherent than I might have thought before, in the sense that it really is a major just turning back of the clock. So it's turning back the clock to the Monroe Doctrine, and that's 200 years ago, right? 202 years ago, I think. 203, now we're in 2026. It's turning back the clock 100 years in terms of fossil fuels. Remember, fossil fuels are dominant. So I think it's turning back the clock in terms of race relations and in terms of recognizing, as Yarrow has been pointing out, the sovereignty of indigenous peoples and other nations. So I think the unifying theme on this is basically turning back the clock.
Yeah, boy. Yeah, those three categories you just described, 3 or 4 categories, that does resonate.
Yeah, and I think that the hard part about that personally that keeps me up at night and saddens me greatly is that we, as a world, finally felt like maybe, it's too strong to say we were taking climate change seriously, but we were starting to make some progress in decarbonization. And the U.S. per capita carbon output has gone down, and China has been level with emissions for the last 18 to 20 months. That's not what we need, but boy, it's better than where we've been in ways. And maybe, we're approaching peak carbon emissions, and maybe even a little faster than people thought we were. But it seems like this administration is doing everything possible to change that trajectory. Will these 4 years matter? And I think this goes back to the question you asked a long ways back of, how much damage is baked into the ice sheet right now.
Mm-hmm.
And those 4 years could be really important a decade or 2 decades from now. And the opinions I hear from people like Mike Mann and those who think more probably about atmospheric dynamics and long-term climate change is that the sooner we start trying to turn the ship, the cheaper it's going to be and the easier it's going to be. And the longer we wait, the more it's going to take and the more expensive it's going to be and the more risky, because out there for Greenland is lying this, what many people refer to as a tipping point, or the straw that broke the camel's back. And as that ice sheet starts to shrink, the more it shrinks, the harder it is to sustain until you hit a point where it essentially gets low enough and small enough that it really is impossible to sustain. And once we've crossed that, then the melting will happen no matter what we do. We're not there yet, but nobody really knows where that tipping point lies. And so the further we go down this path, the greater risk we put ourselves into of an irreversible situation.
Yeah. We're getting toward the end of the hour. This is on a Sunday evening. And so maybe that was a nice summation of a really troubling reality that's part of this. Any thoughts from you? Yeah. Sorry. Your name is interesting, and I hadn't quite your last name and first name. I get them flipped in my head.
Happens
Yarrow.
Happens all the time. Happens at Starbucks. Happens everywhere. Yeah, I mean, as Paul was speaking, I was trying to think about what still gives me hope, and that that list is in flux, but. On climate, on decarbonization, there's so many positive snowball effects happening with renewable energy, especially that I think that the world is going to move on without the United States on just deploying renewable energy, really big scale, developing new technologies related to that. We're going to miss a lot of opportunity as a nation, I think, if we have 4 years of going back 200 years. which is exactly what we're trying to do. And so that made me think about another theme in all of this, which is isolation. We're just headed towards such profound isolation as a nation in so many different ways, I think, where ties to the rest of the world are so very valuable. And, as a scientist, there are much bigger things at stake here than progress in science, but it obviously is something that we all care about. One of the coolest things about my career in science has been just enjoying how international it is. And that aspect of science is part of what's made it so successful, and not just climate science, but all fields of science. That people from all around the world speak to each other and read each other's work and collaborate to try to solve the world's biggest problems. And our collaborations with people in Greenland, just like one example of that. But this growing sense of isolation just really makes me think about all the ways in which international cooperation yield good things for us. And I don't know, that's not a real positive point to leave on.
Well, it's,
but it is a thought.
reality is what it is. I'm hoping, Rubio is meeting with Denmark folks this week coming up, and one can only hope that the scenarios that were laid out in Politico Europe, the European edition of Politico, has kind of four steps that they described, how Trump gets Greenland in 4 easy steps. Now, that's a playful headline. One of the steps is military, and I do not think, personally, if I had to bet on this, I would bet money that won't happen. But the other steps are, this is the bad thing that could happen, influence campaign, that we get in there and mess around, as has happened in Central America and other places in the past, to try to prop up a minority and make it into an excuse for coming in. But the other, let's see, where's step 2 and 3? I thought I had, step 2, offer Greenland a deal. Actually, to just, and the emphasis on the word Greenland there is really important. If there's a way to have as I said earlier, a referendum or some kind of clear signal from the Greenlanders, what they want their future to be like, distinct from what these great power disputes are, that would be a good starting point. We can only hope that is the path forward. There are a couple of quick questions I'd like from viewers that I'd like to bring up, if that's okay. One is from a fellow Mainer, Aviva Alexandra Ramani, an artist, a poet down the coast here. Legally, besides the obvious questions about international law and threatening another country's independence, is there an issue about threatening global stability by escalating climate change? I don't know whether she necessarily means legal. I mean, the Trump administration is pulling out of the convention. Not that it ever had force beyond being aspirational, but
I think this question is right on, and the U.S. military knows this, and they look at climate change as a threat multiplier and a destabilizing effect around the world. And sea level rise tied to climate change is exactly the same thing, because it's going to increase migration. But I don't think this administration is thinking in a chess game like that 2 steps ahead.
No.
They're not thinking about the consequences that are going to come from their actions.
I think you're right about that. And one last bit of input from Marshall Mermel, who says, none of this makes sense from a science-based point of view. Yeah. But then again, this is not about science or anything to do with the good of the people in the U.S., Greenland, or Denmark. This is very similar rhetoric that we saw during the fall of the Weimar Republic in the 1930s, just power for power's sake. He said Trump took us out of 60 programs that have to do with climate change and science-based policy around the world. I actually wrote about that just the other day. And yeah, I don't want to end on that total dark point, but if you had any quick thoughts about that as well. There's this large scale drama playing out along with the micro part of it called Greenland.
I think what gives me hope on this is things are getting so bad and so crazy so quickly that I think that is going to push this country, whether it's the midterms or whether it's massive protests, to change direction. I just worry, the thing that worries me about that is the violence that could come from it. But I think you saw the number of protesters in the street after the ice killing in Minnesota in the middle of winter in horrible weather. What happens by next summer? I think that the country is itself getting close to a tipping point where there's just too much, too fast. That's an odd way to have hope, but I think that's my hope, is that people are coming to their senses and realizing this is not what they voted for.
Well, and speaking up, Yarrow putting together this document, 200 plus voices. It's a part of that mosaic of what has to happen. So I'm really glad that both of you could come on the show. And any last thoughts, Yarrow, from you, and then we can close it out.
On the climate change piece, the United States has never been a very reliable force for progress in that area. It's been up and down. We're all old enough to have lived through a lot of cycles. The U.S. being a leader and the U.S. not being a leader. And I do think that what's happening worldwide will be quite resilient to what's happening domestically in terms of progress on climate change. So that gives me hope as well.
Well, me too. So, and just thank you so much for spending the time here today on this evening to talk about this. This is Andy Revkin. This has been a Sustain What, kind of a pop-up show on a Sunday night, not typical timing. And I will be doing another conversation of this sort on the geopolitics and the basic human rights issues with some folks from Greenland. I had been in touch with some years ago, and at the Circumpolar Council. So stay tuned. Thank you again for tuning in. Anyone watching, you can share the link you've been watching on right away when we're done. Actually, you can go to the scrolling bar at the bottom to get in touch with me with future thoughts. And everyone, hang on for the ride and get involved. Don't sit back. This is not a sit back time. This is find your skill set, put it to use, and make the world a little bit better every day. Thank you again.
Thank you, Andy.
Thanks so much.
And hold on one second.